that's all been played. I would encourage people to get creative and get a picture of the fish in its natural environment. And if you want to find a way to get your mug in there also to be part of it, have fun with it and be creative and do something besides the same old pose that, we've seen tens of thousands of times.
Hey everyone, John here from the Cast and Spear podcast, and today we have Bryan Huskey joining us from KeepEmWet Fishing, where he's going to give us a crash course in everything we need to learn about catch and release fishing so that we can reintroduce the fish back into the wild and have a high probability of survival. So let's jump into the conversation where we get to meet Bryan Huskey. Yeah, so I just wanted to start with, can you give me a little bit of background of who you are, like how you got started in KeepEmWet Fishing?
Yeah. My name's Bryan Huskey. I'm something of a freelance photographer, a filmmaker, just kind of a general outdoor storyteller that does a lot of work in the realm of outdoor adventures. And whether that's, holding the cork handle of a fishing rod or whether that's chasing critters around in the mountains. My background is kind of in those elements. And I happen to be the founder of an organization called KeepEmWet Fishing. And that name derived from a hashtag that I created that I thought was somewhat catchy and communicated some fundamentals of better ways to handle the fish that are intended to be released. And there's a bit of a story that goes behind that maybe we'll get into here. But yeah, that's kind of who I am and how this stuff started.
That's perfect. Yeah, I'd love to hear kind of a little bit about your background in fishing and how, like, where your favorite spots are, or when did you get started? Who influenced you into that?
Yeah. Well, like a lot of us out there, some of my earliest memories were fishing with my dad. He was a traditional tackle angler for salmon and steelhead primarily, and some ocean fishing on the coast of Oregon. And as I grew up and became really interested in fishing myself, it became something that I preferred to do and spend as much time doing as possible with my dad. And then, of course, as I grew up and then on my own and with friends, fly fishing is something that I was drawn to, the challenges involved in it, but in no way, shape, or form did I ever repel away from conventional tackle or bait fishing either. So I've enjoyed fishing of all kinds. Primarily in the Pacific Northwest for the salmon, trout, and steelhead that, we consider local catches and target species, but also a bit of traveling when I can and where I can, and opportunities come around to be able to go somewhere new and chase after a different kind of fish. That's always super exciting, for anybody anywhere. And, a bit of the warm water stuff now as well. Kind of a funny evolution in that I'm kind of, it seems maybe somewhat backwards in what a lot of people's process of fishing evolution, in that now I'm becoming more and more attracted actually to bass fishing and catfish, and then even fishing and shooting carp, as we have invasive species of carp in numbers that are detrimental to healthy populations of other species of fish. And so in some areas we're, trying to reduce those numbers of carp. And so, kind of spread across that entire spectrum.
Nice. What are you shooting the carp with? Are you shooting them with bow and arrow, or spear gun, or?
Yeah, with a bow and arrow, and out of a small boat that we push along very quietly with a pole. Carp are incredibly cagey fish. They are very challenging, whether you're angling for them or hunting them. You don't just go out and it's not just a slaughter fest by accident. I mean, you have to be very deliberate in what you're doing, and which makes it challenging, and that makes it fun.
Absolutely. Well, I see the KeepEmWet Principles. Do you mind going through the three and kind of educating us on what led you to make them?
Yeah, the KeepEmWet Principles are based on three main behaviors, and the principles are designed in such a way that they are applicable to any kind of fish in any scenario whatsoever. So, of course, there's nuances and more specifics that you can get into with any given fish, any given type of fishing, and any given scenario. Some of those we cover in the tips. But when it comes to the fundamental three principles, our first principle is to minimize air exposure. And the fact is that fish, in order to breathe, in order to get oxygen, they have to have water flowing over their gills. And so when you take a fish out of the water and in the period of a handful of seconds, it's always going to vary. When that water stops dripping off of the fish, and its gills are no longer getting fresh water and fresh oxygen, that fish isn't breathing. And so, just like our name says, keeping fish in the water as much as possible and thus minimizing that air exposure. And again, that's just to point out, all of these things are intended for fish that, you're planning to let go. And so this is for when you do put fish back, and you put that fish back because you want it to live. And so that's why we're pointing these things out, so that more fish that are caught and released have a better chance of survival and have a lower chance of some of the negative impacts that can happen. So by minimizing the air exposure, you're keeping that fish breathing. And you're keeping that fish in the water, whether it's at your hand, whether it's you're holding it by the line as it's next to you or the vessel that you're in when you're in the water, or whether it's in an actual net. Having that fish in the water as much of the time as possible is really important, and it's really easy to do. This is just a simple behavior. All of these things are just little behaviors that we can learn about and be better at.
Is there a certain amount of time that's kind of like if I'm going to have it out of the water, no more than 30 seconds? Is it a minute, or is it like 10 seconds? Like, I don't know how long a fish should be out. So is there kind of like rules of thumb?
Yeah. So the first rule of thumb is that the warmer the water temperature and the bigger the fish, the shorter amount of time that fish should be out before it is going to suffer an impact. So summertime and when the water's warm, warmer water contains less dissolved oxygen, and so for that reason, the time, there's a differentiation in the amount of time that's gonna make a difference. There is no set number because everything's going to be circumstantial. So rule of thumb: size of the fish, larger fish need more air, and warmer water has less air, and so they need to be in that water more of the time. Third guideline, rule of thumb that we like to use as an example is another tag, a hashtag that we use that simply states wet fish drip, meaning that, if you are going to pick a fish up out of the water for your picture, for whatever reason, that period of time that you can see water dripping off of the fish, clearly it has to be wet in order to drip. But when those drips stop, that's a good indicator that it's time to make sure that fish is back in the water and still breathing. You can also, hold your own breath for the heck of it. Of course, you're going to be able to hold your breath longer, but that also depends on circumstances. I mean, try running for 5 minutes and then see how long you can hold your breath. And so, again, it's an awareness. Not so much black and white rules and numbers to adhere to. It's more just having that awareness.
Those are awesome. I've never heard of those rules of thumb before. Those are going to be very helpful, especially the running and holding your breath. I think when you have a fish and you've been fighting it for a couple minutes, that's a good perspective. they're out of gas.
Yeah.
And then you take away their oxygen supply.
They are out of gas. I mean, I'm sitting right here in my chair, and I could probably hold my breath for a minute or more, somewhat casually. But go out and run hard, and trying to hold your breath for 10 seconds is excruciating. And so, not trying to draw, direct scientific correlations between us and fish. But again, it gets you thinking about it, and there are, in fact, some correlations that come down to the physiology of what's going on in a fish's body when it's exhausted and then deprived of oxygen on top of that. So it's all about awareness.
Absolutely. How about principle 2, the eliminate contact with dry surfaces?
Yeah, and so that, again, kind of follows off of the first one, but to a different level for a different reason. Fish are slimy, right? Anybody that's ever picked up a fish is like, all right, you're done with that thing, and then you got this slime all over your hands. What's that all about? Well, that slime, or technically it's a mucus layer, is very important for the fish. That is more or less like the fish's skin, and like the skin that we have. So if we take a cheese grater and rip a huge chunk of skin off of any part of our body, number one, that's going to be a problem because it's uncomfortable. Number two, though, what happens with big open wounds? They get infected. And with fish, that protective layer is what prevents them from receiving unnecessary infections. And when you put a fish on a dry surface, whether that's even a dry hand, whether it's a dry carpet of the deck of a boat, up on the dry grass, whatever, the drier something is, the more it tends to attract and retain that slime of the fish. And so when that fish loses that slime and you release it and you think, oh, cool, he swam away fine, but maybe 20% of his, quote, skin is now gone, that could lead to some real problems in the future. And so keeping those fish away from anything dry, not only does it go hand in hand with the air exposure so that they're breathing, but it also pairs with this protective layer.
Yeah, that's very helpful because I've seen a lot of anglers, they'll pull the fish out of the water and then throw it on the deck of, the pier, or, pull them up on the rocks, and, they think that that's okay. And you're just like, oh man.
Yeah.
I love the analogy that you put. It's like it's like taking off, layers of their skin. Like imagine putting sandpaper on your skin and then hoping for the best. It's just not gonna. I know we're trying to we don't want to anamorphize these things too much to humans, but there are some parallels that we can use, at least empathy, empathy for the fish.
Yeah, there are many parallels, and as we're saying here, we're not making direct correlations to these, but it does get you to think about it. And the fact is that when you see so many of these people that are out there that are doing this, that, and the other with the way they're landing their fish, it's not that they're intending, harm on the fish. I don't think anybody out there is like, I'm going to jack this fish up as hard as I can before I release it back into the water because I want this thing to die after a week. I don't think anybody thinks that way. But if more people were aware that some of these things they're doing are jacking that fish up and it may be dying in a week because of that, and it's just unnecessary, I don't think many people would sign up and want to do that. And so we simply want to raise that awareness so that more people out there who, are, great, well-meaning anglers and stewards of resources can be a little bit more educated about what they should and shouldn't do and why.
I love it. It's like conscious fishing, just being a little bit more conscious of the actions.
Yeah, it really is.
Awesome. So principle 3 is the reduced handling. I mean, that kind of goes in line with principle 1 and 2, but is there anything you wanted to chat about with that one? Is there best practices?
Yeah, it does. It certainly does fall into the first two practices, minimizing air exposure, eliminating contact with dry surfaces, and then this third principle of reduced handling. And basically, the reduced handling is going to get you off on the right foot with the first two things, of course, that we just talked about. But then in addition, when you handle a fish, the more a fish is handled, even if it is in the water, even if it's not with dry surfaces, it still runs the risk of impacts to the fish. And that could be because you're handling it to pick it up and hold it up for a picture, or you're handling it because you're taking it over the side of the boat. Point being, when you're picking up a fish and holding it, there's a real good chance of it being dropped. I mean, many of us have handled thousands of fish in our day. We're still going to keep dropping fish, no matter how good you are at holding fish. Every now and then, I mean, they get wild, they kick, and the next thing you know, you're diving in, the hilarious pictures of people dropping fish, going through all kinds of athletic feats to try and catch it. That thing's going to hit the ground, or if it hits something. So the impact of being dropped, in addition to the impact of being squoze in a way, like when you hold a fish, it is so easy to pinch it in a way that damages internal organs. Fish organs are very fragile, and they can be damaged by hands that are holding a fish too tightly. They can, if it's a large fish, be damaged even from their own weight. The weight of a fish isn't designed to support its own mass, and the organs, as fragile as they are, when out of the water, the physics of what can support what totally change up in the air compared to down in the water. And so if it's a very large fish and you're picking it up and you've got this incredible amount of weight in one hand and all that pressure tearing at the ligaments of what holds the heart together and what holds everything, vessels in line and arteries and things like that, it can do internal damage to that fish. And of course, you're never going to see that. You're not going to realize it. You're going to think everybody's stoked and this was all good and the fish swam off. But once again, that just increases the chance of something negative happening after you release that fish, even though you see it swim away and you think it's fine.
No, that's really important. Like I've talked to a few other anglers who have mentioned that as well. And I never even crossed my mind when I was a kid about, the differences in the medium in which they were designed for and how their internals, which you can't see, are still affected by gravity in these different ways. It's like if you hold the fish by its jaw and you hold it vertically, that's totally different body mechanics and structural support members that weren't in place than when the fish is in the water swimming horizontally kind of thing. So it's really eye-opening. It's really eye-opening. That's perfect. I think that principle 3 really segues into the tips, because I know you have, I think, 11 tips on best practices, or 10 tips on best practices. And I would love to first dive into tip number 1 on the reduced angling duration, because, there's a large part of the community who likes the fight, the light tackle, take 20 minutes to bring a fish in, but don't really necessarily think about the downstream consequences of what that's doing to the fish. So I'd love to start with that tip.
Yeah, absolutely. Fish are hard-fighting animals, and they'll fight to the death. And so if you imagine, how long you're playing a fish and how it may or may not give literally everything it has to avoid being caught. And so the longer you extend that period, the more chance there is that that's going to have a negative impact on that fish surviving afterwards, surviving as well as reproducing. And so those are important things to think about. And again, this ties into the warmer water conditions, when we're in conditions that the oxygen levels are low, the longer you play a fish, again, that's not going to be good. So, using the appropriate tackle and not to take away from the enjoyment of relatively light tackle as a reward of angling, satisfaction and enjoyment. I get it. I understand it. But it just comes down to, if you're really fighting the fish hard and getting them in as quickly as you can, that's what we're really hoping for. Using the appropriate tippet and using the appropriate line and drag, and, fight fish hard, get them in as quick as you can. And that's more fun and rewarding than letting something just lay around out there until you slide it in like a wet loaf of bread and it's practically dead at your feet. That's really not nearly as fun or challenging.
100%. How about tip 2? I think this one speaks kind of for itself, the follow local regulations.
Yeah, just because regulations that are in place are typically designed to suit the water that you're fishing, and whether it's something about barbs or whether it's something about keeping fish in the water, or how you handle them. Be aware of that. Be a responsible sportsman or woman out there, and know what you're doing. Be a professional. Know what you're doing, and understand why it's important.
I love that term, be a professional. I think that really just sets the kind of tone. It's like, it's a fun privilege that we have, but just like any privilege, there can be, as soon as we start doing things wrong, or in certain groups think we're doing something wrong, they can influence things and take stuff away, which is unfortunate. So it's like, it's really the responsibility on us to do what's best for the environment so that we have this ability in the future to keep fishing. I love that. Be a professional.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any activity, any recreation we can think about there, we can all close it. We can all imagine just the complete yahoos and ding dongs out there that are doing no favors to the reputation of the user group and the larger ability of whatever recreation to continue. And so, just don't be one of those ding dongs. Be a pro and set a good example.
Absolutely. Perfect. So tip 3 is hold fish over water. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you do land a fish and when you are holding it, because to a degree you are going to have to handle it to unhook it. And, we certainly, we love fish pictures. And so, we're in no way, trying to discourage people from getting pictures with their fish. But when they do hold a fish, as we talked about in the earlier segment about the different principles, fish are so easy to drop. And when you drop a fish and it lands on a rock, it lands on the gunnel of a boat, it lands on something hard and, knocks itself out one way or another, that's a negative impact. And so you can prevent all of those things from happening by just simply keeping the fish low and over the water when you do pick them up or when you do hold them.
Perfect. And then tip 4, this one might have some controversy. No, I'm just kidding. But fish barbless hooks. Yeah,
barbless hooks they just do less damage to the mouth of a fish. It's period. You're pulling out a barbed hook versus a barbless hook, and that barbed hook is going to take a bigger chunk of the fish. It's going to take more force to remove, and then likely do more just actual damage to the mouth of the fish. And there's an argument I think that can also be made in some angling circumstances that a barbless hook can be an advantage. Again, if you're a skilled angler that is aware of what's going on and what they're doing and how to keep tension on the line at all times, you can land, I would argue, just as many fish as somebody with barbed hooks. And I would also say that there are times when a barbless hook will penetrate actually better in the hard mouth species of fish, because of the fact that the circumference of the hook that's entering the mouth and puncturing the mouth is that much smaller. So don't necessarily have a negative opinion about pinching your barbs or using barbed hooks, because they can be just as effective when you do the rest of the things in your fighting technique properly. and they're a hell of a lot easier to pull out of your ear when inevitably at some point in your life you get one in your hand or your ear. Or
Safety of the
else.
angler in consideration. That's funny.
Yeah,
absolutely. Perfect. So tip 5 is now we actually hooked that fish with that barbless hook. Now it's to get them close to us so they don't come off. And you're saying to fish with nets. Do you have anything on that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A net allows you to land fish so much quicker. We talked about the duration of fight time and how the quicker you can land fish, the healthier it is for them and for their survival after being released. You can just bring a fish in and get good with a net. Netting fish is an absolute art and skill in itself. And that's something else to be to practice at and get good at. And it's hilarious to watch somebody that you can tell not too skilled with the net versus somebody that is skilled. And it's a thing of beauty or a thing of absolute comedy, but it is better for the fish. And then that fish can stay in the net while you set down your rod, while you get your camera ready, or while you get your device, your pliers out for whatever you're going to do to unhook that fish. That just allows for the fish to stay in the water, be resting and recovering, as opposed to a circumstance where somebody doesn't have a net. They're going to be more prone to stick their fingers through its gills to hold on to it while they try and get ready to release it, or throw it up on a bank, or squeeze it and crush it, or wrap it up in a bear hug or something like that. None of those things are good for the fish. And being held in a rubberized mesh bagged net is better for the fish overall.
That goes into tip 6, to only use rubber nets. Do you have a specific reason why rubber nets, and do you have like one that you recommend that we should use?
I don't have one. I don't want to recommend anything specifically model-wise, manufacturer-wise, but there are so many now available, fortunately, that have this rubber bag material, as opposed to the thin nylon or woven knotted nets. Those the non-rubber nets have the ability to remove more of the slime off of fish, and they also tend to be more likely to split the fins of the fish, and they are also a super pain when your hooks get snagged in them. And so for all of those reasons, rubber net is fantastic, better for the fish, quicker turnaround with less snags and tangles after the fact of using it. So good for everybody.
I have a woven net. I'm going to have to switch. Now I feel guilty.
Ideally, the rubber net is going to be a much better option.
Perfect. I'll definitely look into getting one of those soon.
Yeah.
So tip 7 is carry a hook removal device. I see forceps in the picture on your site. Is that the best way? Is from what you've seen, or other fish pliers or other devices that you recommend?
Yeah. You don't have to go out and spend a $1 jillion for something super fancy and crazy. Although you can, it blows my mind at what some people create out there for doing something as simple as what a pair of pliers can do. But one way or another, you want to scale your device to the size of the hooks, flies, and fish, or hook or fly, depending on whatever you're using. So it may be appropriate to have a pair of pliers, something sturdier for those larger hooks and larger fish, and then for a smaller fish, little forceps like that. The reason that's important is that it allows you to reach down a little bit further if a hook is in a tough to reach part of the mouth, as opposed to trying to jam your whole hand down in there and trying to get a grip on a fly or a hook. There's just no question that having some pliers or a hook removal device, there's a few of them out there that actually just run a little a firm shaft that has a slot in it to run down the line and then catch on the base of the hook and then push the hook out backwards. Those work really well. And so you're not actually trying to jam your mitt down into the fish's mouth. And then when you are doing that, you're that much more likely to be squeezing the fish with the other hand in order to try and get a grip. It's the monkey with a football analogy. It just can get real ugly really quick. But if you got pliers, you can hold that fish by the tail with one hand and then use the device with the other. And that's usually the most effective way to push a hook out backwards and have that task all taken care of.
Now, sometimes, unfortunately, the fish swallows the lure or they swallow the fly. And, they say in salt water, the hook will rust out in a week or so, if not maybe a month. But I believe in freshwater, that hook can stay in there permanently. Do you have any recommendations or what happens if you gut hook a fish in freshwater?
I agree. It is definitely best to just cut the line when a hook is down further than you can reach. And I believe that the science does exist that says that fish can and will survive with that in there. Even in freshwater, I think they do corrode and break off and pass quicker than we might think. So okay. I have caught trout before in freshwater that I can see a fly or a hook or a remnant of it, and they were definitely rusting and corroding and looking like they were weak. And I don't know, of course, how long it has been in there, but I think that cutting it is always a better move than trying to rip it out if you can tell that it's going to just totally screw the fish up in the process.
Absolutely. And there's probably some kind of stomach acids and stuff like that in there as well that I'm not taking into account to add to the corrosion.
Yeah. Who knows what kind of crazy corrosive things those fish are eating down there.
Awesome. Tip 8 is photograph wet fish. Do you have any best practices on how to take these photos, especially for the millennials out there trying to take selfies and they're by themselves? I know it'd be easier if you had a fishing partner take a picture of you with the fish, but we're all not always with somebody else. Do you have any best practices?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge to try and get your selfie with the fish. I would say, first of all, as the point mentions, photograph wet fish. Keep the fish in the water for your pictures. Set good examples. If you do lift the fish up out of the water, seeing that fish is still dripping is really an indication that you are doing your best to follow practices that, are going to increase the likelihood that fish is going to survive. Getting the camera down close to the water and close to the fish, whether it's a handheld camera or whether it's a smartphone or whatever, is always going to give you the best results. And what that means is even putting the camera, if you think about it, there are ways that you can do a selfie by yourself with your phone and a fish in the water. It's going to work sometimes and maybe not work other times, but it's going to make for a more unique picture if you do put that camera right down at the water level. Most smartphones now are water resistant and or the cases that you can put them in. And so honestly, the pictures that are best for the fish are usually the coolest, best looking pictures anyways. We've all seen plenty of grip and grins where the fish is high, held in the standard pose and totally air dried and over the top of on the bow of a boat or over the shore or laying on the bank. That's all been played. I would encourage people to get creative and get a picture of the fish in its natural environment. And if you want to find a way to get your mug in there also to be part of it, have fun with it and be creative. And I think the results will be a lot better and break the mold. I mean, we got to be so sick of seeing all of the posers and literally, like the standard we're not taking away from doing a grip and grin, but just be creative and do something besides the same old pose that, we've seen tens of thousands of times.
I agree. I'm guilty of the standard pose, so I need to step up my creative game. I set an example, right? I love that.
Breaking that mold and doing something different it's gonna bring you good results as far as the response and reaction to social media content that looks a little bit different than what everybody's always seen and always done. So have fun with it.
Absolutely. So tip 9, you talked a little bit earlier about, not gripping it like a football and crushing the insides. And even though you can't see it, you're still doing damage. But do you have any best practices on how to grip? Because I know I see a lot of people, grab by the jaw, and that could put a lot of pressure on it, or grab behind the gills, and that ruins their ability to breathe. And that's a very sensitive area. So is there a best zone on the fish, the tail, the underbelly, stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. For one, once the fish reaches a size where you kind of are like you can kind of tell, like, are you going to drop it with one hand, or are you going to have to squeeze it to death in order to keep from dropping it? And when you say yes to either of those, that's when you know that really the best handling is going to take two hands. So that's the first thing to kind of be aware of, whatever the species and size of fish. Most fish have a portion at the beginning of the tail called a wrist, and I like to make an A-OK symbol with one hand and put those fingers around that wrist, just touching your thumb and one of your forefingers. But that is better, I think, than trying to squeeze the whole wrist with your whole hand, because when you kind of squeeze the whole tail with your whole hand, the tail collapses and you have less of a pinch point, so to speak, to hold on to. And so just using your thumb and one finger, I think, is the best way to wrap around the tail. And then you want to support the front of the fish, typically between its pec fins. And you want to have a flat hand as opposed to squeezing. It's kind of like if you imagine being picked up by some, a couple of hands out of the sky. If they picked you up carefully, you would probably be more, at least, like, just freaked out than if they grabbed you and started breaking your legs. You'd be, kicking and scrambling. So kind of like put yourself in the situation of the fish, hold it gently and don't squeeze it. And it's more likely to chill out and be cooperative for you. So, again, holding them fish low and over the water is going to help with that. In the event when you, if you do lose the grip and drop it. But just in general, hold the fish gently, firmly by the tail, but so that so you can keep hold of it, but don't squeeze it up front.
Absolutely. And now we have the fish. We took our picture, we've held it carefully, and we put it back in the water, and the fish is just not moving. How do we get that fish to revive in the best possible way?
Yeah, hopefully we don't have the situation where the fish is not moving. If so, I hope you got room in the cooler and room in the in the legal limit, but so that you can take that fish to the home for the grill. But it is important to revive fish in circumstances when they are not ready to go. So the best thing to do, first of all, is if a fish is ready to beat it, then let it go. If it's you're all done and he's all done, don't think that you are doing any favors by prolonging your handling process by, quote, now I'm going to revive it. Well, if the fish is trying to get away, then go ahead and let it go. But in those circumstances, when it's sluggish, when it has trouble keeping its balance, when its eyes don't roll upward as you roll the fish around in the water, you should be able to see that eye moving around. Just the reflex of the fish keeping its balance and its eye looking upward are ways that you can tell when a fish is in a bad state. And when it is in a bad state, or until it tries to swim off on its own. You want to be facing that fish into the current if you're in a water that has current, or pushing it forward in the water if it's in an area where you don't have current. Pulling it backward is not going to hurt the fish, but it is going to breathe much better when the water is flowing in through its mouth and passing over its gills and then exiting its gill plate. So you want to just be pushing water in its mouth until it revives and tries to swim off on its own.
So when you're saying there's no current, it's flat water, and you're pushing it forward, and you, not necessarily it's bad to pull it back, but are you trying to make it kind of like a figure eight or a circle, like around you, so it gets the water going in that one direction, and then as soon as it starts to get life, you let it go? Or what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. Whether it's in a circular motion or whether it's in a, if you're straight up and want to do like a figure eight, if you're in a boat or bent over the fish, the important point of it is to be pushing that fish forward through the water. The more water that is going directionally in the mouth, that is what is benefiting the fish, is the fish's ability to breathe. So when you're pulling it back, if you're just going back and forth, that forward motion is helpful. The backward motion is not. So however you want to do it, you want to do it in a way that maximizes the forward motion.
Perfect. Well, that covers all of the tips. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that section?
Well, no, not anything else I need to add to that section. A couple other things I would mention, but absolutely. I don't know if we wanted to go into another, if you had another segment we want to talk about, I could.
Well, no. So the thing that I was going to ask you next was, what really grinds your gears? So some of the things that really annoy you that you see that, really we should be kind of more cognizant of, unless we've already covered that in all the tips. The next part was going to just be more information outside of your website. Like, was there any resources that people, that really turned you on that you'd find beneficial? And then after that, it's going to just go into, how can people find you and all that stuff. So if you have, what was the section that you were kind of interested in adding? I want to touch on the things that KeepEmWet is not. Another thing that is important that we really hope people will realize about what KeepEmWet fishing is and is not, we really want to unite science and angling communities. We want to encourage best case handling of the fish that we catch and plan to release. What's just important, though, is for us to point out what we're not, meaning that this is not just intended for fly fishing. This movement does have origins and roots in the fly fishing community. That just happens to be where I kind of started it, but it applies to angling of all kinds, any kind of fish, in any kind of water, anywhere on earth. These steps, these principles, this awareness is beneficial. And we're not at all opposed to people keeping their fish. I mean, KeepEmWet Fishing in reality is not a catch and release organization. We just simply promote catch and release practices that are going to be most helpful and most effective if they're chosen to be used. And so if you're an angler out there who doesn't think of themselves as a catch and release angler because you like to take fish home, you like to cook fish and fill the freezer and put them on the grill, that's fantastic. We totally 100% support that. And we actually feel like those are people that do need to know about these catch and release practices, because even if you don't think of yourself as a catch and release angler, there's still a lot of scenarios when you end up throwing fish back for one reason or another, whether it's not the appropriate size, whether it's not the appropriate species, whether it has something to do with a limit of one kind of fish versus another.
we all throw a fish back on occasion. And we just believe that if we're going to practice, fish are going to be thrown back as catch and release, we ought to do it right. And so we want to help more people learn how to do that. And then finally, I just wanted to say that, KeepEmWet Fishing does not at all support, negative shaming and social media squabbling and using the KeepEmWet name and phrase and hashtag to be weaponized or to shame other people. We think that that's just ridiculous. We're out there to catch fish, to have fun, to eat, food that we bring to our own table and know where it came from. And we don't want to be part of any kind of name calling or belittling somebody else who, maybe doesn't know any better or has never had the chance to learn about some of these things. And so we really hope that people think of KeepEmWet as a resource for those who choose to learn, and keep it in a positive conversation and opportunities to learn and do good, and not at all to create one class of angler against another.
That makes perfect sense, and totally agree with all of that. Do you have anything that really kind of grind your gears in the angling community that you've seen? Like, it sounds like this whole kind of like shaming is happening. I haven't really been too much aware of it, but is this like what's going on?
Well, it does. There's people that do call one another out for, poor handling and hypocrisies of one kind of picture versus another. And yeah, that is definitely something that grinds our gears, that makes us feel bad, because we don't want to see this opportunity to learn become weaponized or used as an insult. And so that's one of the things that's frustrating. Some of the other things that can be frustrating are when anglers that really do know better, but just choose time and time again to ignore the physical condition and the likelihood that a fish is going to, survive, because they just don't make it a priority to recognize that. There are a lot of anglers out there with social media audiences that are large. And, it comes back to kind of something we talked about earlier, which I think is important, is that, if you want to be viewed as a pro angler, then act like a pro. And by acting like a pro, you're educated, what's going on. I mean, you put a lot of time and effort and energy and money into having everything you do, every part of your fishing experience, the best it can be. And whether that's your knowledge of how and where and when and why to catch different kinds of fish, or what kind of equipment you choose to use, it's professional also to understand what's happening with the fish that you throw back. And we encourage people to, be leaders and set good examples, because the more fish that get thrown back in the water and survive, the more fish that we'll all get to enjoy in the future. And so that's important to us. Another tiny little thing that's kind of funny that seems to be a tough habit to break are anglers that'll use a net, but as soon as they catch a fish and have it in the net, they feel the need to keep the net up in the air. And I've never understood that. The fish isn't any more likely to fly away than it is to swim away once it's in the net. So why not let that fish be in the water so that it is breathing during that time, rather than keeping it up in the air, getting dried out?
I have no answer to why they do that as well. I've seen it quite a bit. It's kind of funny. Well, maybe they are afraid of the flying fish. Maybe it's something we don't know. Perfect. Yeah. Do you have any resources, books that you gift often, or websites that you like, or blogs that you recommend that people can kind of learn more, not just about this topic, but just about fishing in general, like things that you like to share?
We really build our website, KeepEmWet.org, in a way that it can be a resource, and whether it's for finding simple tips for whether it's finding, as I literally call it, bloggy stuff. We have quite a bit of bloggy stuff, and we have a lot of science. And a lot of these scientific articles are as nerdy and in-depth and geeky as you can absolutely imagine. But we also take those and we condense them down into Cliff Notes versions, similar to Cliff Notes, not actually Cliff Notes, but we do our own series we call Finsights, so that regular people can take a look at what happened in a specific research study, and they can understand who did what and why and what it means for us as anglers. And, they're about a 5-minute read. And so we try and take a lot of gnarly scientific information and make it accessible and understandable for anglers like myself that literally glaze over trying to read, one page into what the actual science lingo and descriptions go into, because those are pretty dry content.
Awesome. So I think that's about it for what we have. I'd love for people to reach out and find you guys and, strike up a conversation. What's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah. On social media, we're at KeepEmWet Fishing. We're active on Instagram, and we're somewhat active on Facebook, to very diverse audiences there, as I'm sure your listeners know. And then KeepEmWet.org. And from there, they can contact us, drop us a note, let us know, what they like or, what they hate about what we're doing. We love hearing from anglers. We do a newsletter monthly, and they can subscribe to our newsletter and stay informed on what's going on and what we're up to without having to check back to the website. We'll just pop it out in monthly newsletters to their inbox.
Perfect. Thanks, Bryan. Well, that does it for this episode of the podcast. Big thank you to Bryan Huskey. You're doing great work. I've learned a ton of information, and I'll definitely be, hopefully, reintroducing fish into their environment with a high probability of success so that they stay alive and we all have the ability to catch fish going forward. So if you haven't already done so, please leave a comment and a rating on Apple's podcast platform. It will help me spread this podcast to more people, and I read every single comment. So if you have any ideas on how to make this podcast better for you, definitely let me know. And until next time, keep those lines tight, everyone. See ya.